Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Amanda Rogerson. I am a product marketer with Duo Security, a business unit in Cisco. Today, we are going to be talking to Demystify this thing called Zero Trust, and I have a special guest that I'll introduce in a little bit. So, Steve, before we get into the discussion that we want to have today, just want to sort of level set for us. When we think of zero trust, what we realize is that everybody is talking about this in a different way. Everyone has a different perspective, everyone calls it something different, and everybody approaches it from a different point of view. For example, some of the customer conversations that I've had the pleasure to have around this, some of the things that I've heard are around, some of them do say, hey, we have a zero trust security practice, and that helps us launch into a very specific discussion around zero trust strategy, but not everybody starts there. Some customers have come to me and said, in this world where we have so many people that are remote, I really need to focus on securing remote access. And when we start into that conversation, we can talk around how, they can do alternatives to VPN, they can have their VPN, they can add security, and have really defense in depth around securing those remote workers and securing their environment, which is a part of a zero trust security strategy. Other people are focusing on how do we segment our network and how do we actually create buckets to make sure that people are only traversing areas of our network where we need them to be traversing. So again, we have conversations around the technologies and the solutions that they can start to put in place and how they can methodically improve their security practice around their network traffic, which leads into a zero trust conversation. And then lastly, I don't have visibility, again, as we all shift into this remote work world, we have more and more things connecting to our environment. How do we know that those things that are connecting are secure? How do we know that the things connecting between our workloads, between our data centers, between all of the things that drive and run our business are not introducing any risk? The way that we get at that is by having visibility, by being able to set policies around the things that are traversing our environment so that we can have those controls. And that leads into a conversation about a zero trust strategy. Even if I think of how the industry has been talking about it, we've come at it from a lot of different ways. So we started talking about it with deperimeterization with the Jericho Forum. Then we started talking about it with Beyond Corp, with Google's methodology. And we had CARTA come in with Gartner, which is continuous. I can never remember what the acronym means. But all of these things arose by any other name. It's really all just zero trust. So, we're talking about the same principles, the same practices, the same ideas. No matter what we call it, all of it is moving towards this idea of establishing trust at that point of access so that we can make sure that the people, the devices, the applications, everything in our environment has that additional security layer. But as I said at the top, we know that everybody is at a different stage of their adoption. So there was a Pulse Secure report that came out last year they did a survey of over 500 IT professionals, mostly based in the US, and just asking them sort of, how are you thinking about zero trust and what stage are you at in your adoption and where are you going with this? And sort of how are you modifying and transforming your security practice to realize some of the principles and practices that are espoused in a zero trust methodology? So it's really interesting when you start to think about this and talking about this in the industry. We're all talking about it in a different way. And there seems to be, a lot of confusion around what it really means and how we get started. What isn't unclear is that there are clear benefits when we start to think about deploying a zero trust security strategy and modifying and evolving our current practices, right? A lot of times when we start putting solutions in place that support a zero trust methodology, we see increased security, visibility, and productivity. The value behind a zero trust approach isn't that we're just adding more gates, more barriers, and more controls, but we're doing so in a way that actually reduces the friction for the users. And what we see as well as a benefit is we start to be able to move to decreasing some of our costs because we can consolidate solutions. And we're not spending as much time reactively responding to security incidents, we can start to be proactive and actually mitigate some of those breaches, some of those risks, and some of the data exfiltration that actually ends up costing our businesses more. And then as well, when we have a very clear strategy around how we're going to evolve our infrastructure towards a zero trust methodology, we're actually able to decrease the time to deliver on a lot of these security initiatives and projects. Sure, if you think of your own environment and the initiatives that you have in play, the different projects that you have, you probably end up having conflicting priorities in terms of what you need to do first, and you don't have enough talent or enough resources to be able to execute across the broad spectrum of different things that you have and that you're responsible for in your environment. No matter what level of the environment you're at, whether you are an IT administrator, an implementer, or somebody who's more responsible for the strategy, when we start talking about zero trust, we can start to think of how are we going to offer incremental improvements to our security while reducing that friction to our users, taking a more proactive approach to our security practice versus reactive. So it really is an evolution. But sometimes that can be really challenging to sort of wrap our minds around because we have so many conflicting things going on in our environment. So there's a lot of common objections that come up when I'm talking to different organizations, right? I don't have a budget for zero trust, and that's why we talk about it in a different way, right? Change that conversation and start thinking about, well, what are your projects that you do have budget for? What are the security solutions that you're looking for? The other one I already mentioned was time. I have so many conflicting projects. There's no way I can add something else into that bucket list. And I really challenge you to start thinking about adopting a zero trust security practice in terms of, it's not something new that you're going to have to do. It's not a new project. What you're doing is just evolving the current projects you have to have a common methodology in terms of looking at how is this going to help me establish trust in my environment. And then when I think of the environments, there's a lot of complexity. Like even as we've done this massive shift into a remote workforce, we're going to see another shift again as we start to all return to the office, and it's going to be more hybrid. So we have applications in the cloud, we have legacy applications, we have on-premise applications, we have things that are behind our firewalls, things that are in front. There's a lot of moving parts when we think about our infrastructure and our environment. So that's another common objection that comes up. And that also leads into those challenges, right? How do I apply one simple security practice across a hybrid infrastructure? I've got things everywhere. How do I make sure that I can apply the same security controls no matter where my applications or my servers or my infrastructure is? And then the other problem that we see as a challenge that comes up is resistance. Let's face it. Security is the last thing that most end users are happy to hear about, because for them, as soon as they hear about security, they're like, oh, you're just going to make my life more difficult. You're going to add more gates. I'm going to have to do more in order to be able to get in and do my work and access my things. So what we want to do with that is we want to start thinking about how we can shift that and actually bring our users into that security conversation so that they're empowered to actually be security agents within your environment. We're going to talk about that a little bit when we start talking about some of the challenges around this adoption. And then the most common one that I hear the most frequently is, where do I even start? And I can't stress enough, you've been doing security probably in your environment for years. And by talking to you and thinking about zero trust, we're not saying that what you've done is wrong, bad, has holes, or anything like that. What we're saying is what we want to do with a zero trust approach is start to evolve that security practice that you had so that you can actually reduce some of your friction in your environment with your users, so that you can extend that security across to everything, and so that you can really start to, again, evolve into that more proactive approach where you're building those trust relationships so that you don't have as many stressors in your day. So enough about all of what I think. I've invited Steve and Wolf to join me. I've had many great conversations with them, and we were having a chat the other day, and we were starting to go through some of those myths that were coming up, and I thought, hey guys, I'd love for you to join me so that we can actually share our little conversation with everybody. So, Steve, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself to our listeners today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda. So, hi, everybody. Steve Turner. I'm a security and risk analyst here at Forrester. I cover zero trust, network security controls, and ransomware pretty extensively. Prior to Forrester, I was a practitioner working at a number of different Fortune 500 companies, and I'm happy to be here today.
Awesome. I'm so glad you're able to join us. And Wolf, you and I have had many, many conversations around this. So I'm so pleased that you're here with us today. Can you introduce yourself?
Many, many. Thank you for having me, Amanda. And Steve, I'm really looking forward to the conversation and hearing your experience. So I am advisory CISO with Duo Security. My background is in highly regulated industries. I worked in healthcare. I worked in financial services, leading IT and IT security efforts.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Now, just for everybody tuning in, just so that you sort of have a lay of the land and sort of how the rest of the 45 minutes together we have are going to go. What I've done is, drawing on Steve's analyst experience, really wanted him to give us sort of this overview of the state of the industry, the state of zero trust, and sort of what he's observing through the work that he's been doing. And then we're going to do a fun fact or fiction. So there's been a lot of things that all three of us have heard in different conversations. And what we really want to do is just do a little bit of myth busting. And then everybody who signed up, you all had the opportunity to submit some questions. So we actually have some really great questions that came in through that submission. So we're going to cover those off. And then we'll do a quick wrap up just at the end so that we bring everything back home. So with all of that, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you and the wonderful content that you have to share today.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. So, in order to understand zero trust, right, we have to understand kind of the landscape that led us to want to even look at, a new security model like zero trust. So just for baselining sake, when we went and kind of pulled folks out in the industry, specifically folks in security who are responsible for making a lot of these decisions, we found that almost 60% of organizations were breached within the last year. That's a crazy high number. And year over year from 2019 into 2020 and what we're expecting to see in 2021 is that that's going to continue to increase by double digits. So, the thing that we're gathering from that and the thing that we have to assume is that the way that we've been doing security up to this point is not working. Organizations are going to continue to be breached. We need to prepare for that. We need to be able to limit, what happens, when our organization inevitably gets breached. And then a really interesting statistic that we pulled out of that data as well was that 48% of those breaches were the result of internal incidents. So again, the perimeter-based security models that we are all kind of like have within our organizations and need to evolve from, that doesn't take into account, what's kind of behind those four walls. And then some of the other, vectors that we kind of see here continue to rise and continue to be things that we need to address overall. We can't keep doing the same thing we've always been doing. Next slide, please. So when we talk to folks, right, you can take a look at this meme and see what it really represents whenever we have those conversations. They tell us that, yes, we know what this zero trust thing is. Yes, we know what, like that's something we need to do. But then when we ask them, what they believe zero trust to be, they pull random security terms kind of, out of the woodwork or out of, like kind of the mind share that they already have. And the conversation around zero trust, like Amanda mentioned earlier, is that there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of, kind of hearsay kind of all over the place that we need to weed through in order to understand what we're actually moving towards. Next slide, please. So again, kind of taking from the data that we have here at Forrester, we asked people what their top strategic, IT security priorities or information security priorities were over the last year or so. And we can see, again, out of the almost 4,000 folks that responded to the survey, that zero trust, was 24%. But again, when we look at this data and we go back to that slide before of the kind of level setting what the understanding of zero trust is, that 24%, is that buzzword or is that reality? Next slide, please. So what's kind of contributed to that? We see that kind of, the vendors out there, in the industry that have kind of latched on to this zero trust term that's kind of bled into the mindset, especially recently. They're trying to tie whatever they're selling back to zero trust or advertise it, that you can purchase zero trust. And we know that not to be true, especially with what was covered earlier, in the webinar today. We know that, there's, the people side of things, the process side of things, and then ultimately the technology that helps enable zero trust. So, in this wonderful meme that's kind of up here on the screen, you can see that the folks that are kind of like exuding, what reality actually is kind of being thrown out the window. But we are seeing that there are vendors on both sides of this, right? Ones that are perpetuating the idea that you can purchase it, and then ones that are actually leaning into it and helping organizations down their journeys. Next slide, please. So what does that make us all feel like, right? That makes us feel confused, sad, angry. It continues to make us all have this gigantic misunderstanding of what zero trust entails and what we have to care about. And then the biggest thing that I hear from kind of my angle or my seat is that is zero trust a product? Is it a framework? Is it a strategy? Is it an architecture? And so many other different types of things. And then, of course, the folks that are just so tired of the marketing BS that's out there, those folks are like, zero trust is fake news. And that's not something that anybody wants to hear because it is an implementable, real information security model. Next slide, please. So, how do we get started? Where do we level set? Where do we baseline things? This is something that, as we kind of assess where organizations are at out there, we need to start from level one. We need to understand and help them understand what zero trust is, redefine it for them, make them understand that it isn't marketing hype. It isn't just marketing speak. Take back the term and make them understand that it is achievable. A lot of organizations don't realize that they got their first taste of zero trust during the pandemic when they were forced to maybe dump some of their more traditional security solutions, such as VPNs, to move to things like Zero Trust Edge or ZTNA. And then we realized that a lot of organizations don't have the resources in order to implement these overarching, very large technology solutions. So they need things that plug and play or integrate extremely well together, and that they should only be ripping and replacing the technologies they have, where maybe potentially cost savings are possible, or if the technology that they have doesn't integrate extremely well into, that path down to zero trust. Next slide, please. So the thing that we all need to remember is that, compared to the past when we were deploying, perimeter-based, security technologies, this isn't just a one big gigantic product that you're buying and slapping in and calling it, done and calling it great. It's a bunch of different, people, processes, and technology solutions. And it's a continuous journey that evolves with whatever your organization's doing. For us at Forrester, that's something that we've been trying to drive the point home around, is that all of those different things that I mentioned, and ultimately the technology that helps enable you to get there, they need to ebb and flow in lockstep with whatever your company is trying to achieve. I compare it to, with the older security models, perimeter-based security models, that was in the way security. Zero trust needs to be out of the way security and only there when things go bad or things kind of get to a state where it needs to be in your face. And then ultimately, security needs to be top of mind for everybody. Zero trust is that opportunity for everybody to have security baked into what they do every day. So thank you.
That's awesome. So I think, what becomes interesting for me, or when I start to think about this and start to have my own conversations around it, like everything you said is right, bang on the mark, Steve, because I hear a lot of the same things in the conversation. So it's kind of interesting that, you're in a different seat than I am, but it's the same dialogue that's really happening no matter where we are. And I think Zero Trust has this unfortunate past history because of what it's called, right? It's called Zero Trust. And Wolf, I know you and I have talked about this a couple of times, because if I get into some of our fact or fiction, first thing that people think of when they hear Zero Trust is like, I'm not going to trust anybody. That's it. No trust at all. So, well, you and I have heard this a lot, right? Is Zero Trust means starting with no access. Fact or fiction, my friend?
So a little bit of both, right? So the one thing is, and Steve, I really liked how you framed it up in terms of applying these principles and going back to first principles. And so if you think about first principles, we do need to think about default deny. We do need to think about least privilege. From a authentication perspective, zero means zero. And so we do need to think about least trust. And I think the fact is in the kernel there, right? Let's start with no access. Let's start with no trust. But where we wade into fiction is where we think that no means no, and we're never going to extend trust and develop those connections. And so when we think about zero trust, the fiction side is, no, never, no, you're done. The fact is that we're going to, based on context, based on conditions, and we're going to do it at the point of connection. We're going to do it at the point of authentication and do it dynamically. And so there's a little bit of both in this fact or fiction one, but it really is, to my mind, fiction when it's taken to the extreme.
Yeah, and I think that's a great part. Like, we all think, or I know for myself, historically, the security team has always been the department of no, right? It's no. But I think what Zero Trust does is it starts to evolve that, so that the security teams start to become the department of now. Like, what can we do now, and how can we protect that now? And I think, Steve, you have a little bit of perspective on that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest thing I want to highlight here that, Wolf, I think you highlighted kind of briefly in that statement is that, Zero Trust is about building organizational trust, right? Moving to a Zero Trust model will help your organization to become more trusted and give, those organizations that competitive edge that they're looking for in the market. But, at the end of the day, like, moving to a Zero Trust security model allows businesses to be more flexible with what they're allowing their employees to do, because security is baked into the DNA of everything. I really liked, Amanda, the terminology used that, security becomes the department of now. I'm so used to from my previous roles, changing that narrative from no to now, because people don't understand that, the way that the world operates today, that digital competitive edge is everything. Security can't be saying no to a lot of things. They need to find ways to enable things. And Zero Trust kind of has that baked into what it's helping organizations accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that actually leads really nicely into our next factor, fiction. Because when I think about, again, if I think of that security department in my own experience, every time they've put a security control in place, it's like, oh, you don't trust me. Like, you don't trust. I'm going to figure out my own way to work around whatever you're putting in because I'm smarter than you. And everybody thinks they know better than their security team, but we're very resourceful, especially in the IT world, right? We figure out the way to get things done in the way that we need to get it done. So that's why I said, when I was going through that, there's a challenge with resistance. I think it's so important that, we bust this idea of zero trust, meaning we don't trust people, because it's really about bringing the people and bringing the employees into that security conversation. And Steve, I know you and I have chatted about that a bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the biggest thing I want to highlight here, right, is, getting away from, the fiction that zero trust means that you don't trust your employees. I think a lot of folks already were sitting in that seat, when we're talking about security, unfortunately. Everybody loves to talk about putting in controls to make sure that employees don't harm themselves in order to get the job done. But how many times, have we've seen controls bypassed because of the exact reason, of an employee trying to get the job done? We saw it especially during the pandemic. Forrester's done a whole bunch of surveys and research in this area and find that and we found that the reason that security controls are bypassed the majority of the time is because they needed to get their work done. So what does that say about what we've been doing in the past? And I don't think it's fair to pair this with zero trust terminology, because again, I'm going to go hark back to the terminology I used earlier. Zero trust should be that out of the way security, model that you're implementing, not the in the way security that everybody's used to, especially from, the employee side of things, bypassing because they couldn't get their job done and they were just trying to, put food on the table at the end of the day. So I think this is it's such a huge myth that we dispel almost every single day with some level of inquiry from our end user clients. So I'm really happy that we called this out.
Yeah, well, when I was thinking of this, I have two teenagers at home they live on the internet. So for me, I can take it even into a personal experience, because I know for myself, if I put controls in place, they're going to do whatever they can possibly do to work around that and do what they want to do. Well, I have talked about that a little bit. I'm like, how do I restrict my kids from doing these things? But what I found, like, even if I take it into that out of the workplace and into my own personal experience, when I actually brought them into that discussion and empowered them to actually start to make some of those choices and self-remediate things, and, that was actually advice you gave me, Wolf. So it made my life a whole lot easier with my teenagers. So I know you have some thoughts on this too.
Yes, there's a lot of similarity with parenting teenagers and implementing enterprise security. The human-centric security, the idea that, Steve, that you touched on about security that gets out of the way, human-centric security has to first enable the user and at the same time disable the adversary, because we know that the more constraints we put on people, the more creative the people get to get their jobs done. And the more creative they get, the more dangerous they get in terms of finding their own way. And so I am wholeheartedly on board with this is a myth. We need to dispel it. And also, I would say what's fascinating about zero trust is traditional trust boundaries were very binary and very long-lived. I trusted you or I didn't. And it was in the way insofar as a control and something that needed to be circumvented or additional steps that the workforce needed to perform. A well-implemented zero trust architecture is effectively invisible to the user. When they're on their devices, coming from where they normally come from, accessing what they normally access, and everything is copacetic, you don't even see a thing. It only gets in the way when we need to, and it only gets in the way that first and foremost stops the adversary. So I think that idea of not trusting the employee, no, absolutely not. Extending appropriate amounts of trust to the employee and having amount of dynamicness about those controls, absolutely. That's where we need to go.
Yep. And it becomes really interesting. Like, all three of us have sort of been talking about this sort of the traditional security model where we had, these things in place. So I think that leads into the next myth, as it were, fact or fiction question that I encounter a lot is, hey, if I do zero trust, I'm going to need to rip and replace everything. Like, you're telling me my So I actually had one customer and they were talking to me and they're like, so you're telling me everything I've been doing for years is wrong and now I need to completely just dismantle it all and build it from the ground up. And I know that's not the case. And you know, Wolf, you and I have chatted about that a little bit too.
Yeah, because this is one that is incredibly frustrating to me. And I get it. Again, from a pundit perspective, from a security control perspective, what are all the frameworks start with? I know everything. I can see everything. I have everything in control and everything is encrypted. Great. However, the reality is in the modern enterprise, that isn't the case. We may know a small portion. We may have control over a small portion. And that control and that knowledge is going to vary throughout any given time period. So the idea that you don't get any value from zero trust until you rip and replace is incredibly frustrating to me, because I believe that you can tightly scope areas. This particular work group, this particular application, this particular type of access. I believe you can tightly scope the areas and apply these principles there and then do an iterative process. And I think that's much more in line with how modern technology is supported and maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that we definitely talk about a lot when we approach our customers is we really want to meet them where they are. And actually, you know, there's all these industry architecture diagrams that are out there. And Steve, I know Forrester has one. There's actually a model, I think, that resonated most with us and the approach we wanted to take to show up in the market when we were talking about things. So I know you've got some view on this too.
Yeah, so you know, at Forrester, you know, we have this idea of the zero trust extended ecosystem framework, you know, allowing you to kind of take an assessment of whether you have point solutions or a portfolio solution of different, you know, kind of features and functionality in that technology that kind of helps you get to, you know, a zero trust state. But the biggest thing that I want to highlight, and a lot of the discussions that I have that kind of, you know, Wolf, you mentioned some of this, like a lot of the discussions that I have with like our end user clients or even, you know, other peers within the industry is that portfolio versus point solution debate, you know. And the biggest thing that I say to them that kind of throws them for a loop every time is like, why not both? I don't understand, why do you have to throw out some of your existing investments? Because like Wolf mentioned, you know, we're all about visibility here. What areas, you know, are still dark within your environment and that you have no visibility into? Because a really, really good zero trust architecture includes significant amounts of visibility in all areas that you can uncover that. Because zero trust is all about context, right? Having that visibility informs that context in order for you to make an access decision or decision within your enterprise about whether you're going to allow that employee to access a resource or not. So this idea of needing to rip and replace all the investments that you made over the years is definitely totally and completely false. Like it's not something that, you know, you may have made really good investments, and over time maybe some of those investments you do need to throw out and find something different because you don't have the visibility or the preventative controls that you're looking for that are part of going down this zero trust path. But you don't need to go whole hog and just be like, you know what, I'm just going to take everything that I've done throughout the years and be like, you know, I need something new. That's not in the interest of going down a zero trust, you know, journey. It's not in the interest, I think, of anybody who would advocate for that. I think that, you know, we're seeing, especially, you know, from the vendor side of things, you know, ecosystems being built around point solutions or those integrations kind of happening all over the place, and more emphasis being put on that because they realize that things need to be integrated together in order to achieve, you know, zero trust.
Yeah, no, that's great points. I think, you know, when you think of it, and I think of the customers I've talked to as well, the reality is there's so many different industries, there's so many different verticals, there's so many different sizes of organizations. And everybody, like I said earlier, everybody's at a different stage of sort of figuring out what this all means for them, looking at their existing environment and modifying it. It was kind of interesting, and I know our listeners today, we have a wide range of people listening in from all different sizes of organizations. One of the things I hear most often is that this doesn't apply to me. I'm a small, medium business, or I'm a smaller shop. I don't have the budget. I don't have the people. Zero trust isn't for us. It's only for large organizations. And Steve, you and I have talked about this a little bit. Zero trust. You and I know that zero trust applies to anybody, anywhere, at any time. But I'd love if you have additional context that you can add into this one around, this is only for a large org.
Yeah. So I think that this myth comes about from the idea that I think that the marketing and the vendor ecosystem initially kind of pushed, smaller organizations to believing that this was fact, because they kind of spun the technology side of things, kind of drove this idea that you need to make these large overall investments, going back to the previous slide about rip and replace, having to be a thing, in order to get to zero trust. Zero trust is for everybody. There's both, products that you can buy from a technology perspective to help enable you get to zero trust. But there's also tons of open source, ways that you can enable those different technology levers that you need to kind of throw in order to enable zero trust to happen within your organization. And we're seeing more and more vendors cater to those smaller organizations to give them, the technology they need to achieve zero trust. But the biggest thing, and Wolf had mentioned this like way earlier on a different topic, is, if we just take a step back, right, when we look at the principles behind zero trust and this idea of, never trusting but always verifying things. If you just take that mantra and those principles and apply it to the way that you're building security and, processes, people, everything within your organization, then it doesn't matter the organization size. I'd argue that for medium and smaller organizations, it's easier to implement zero trust because they're not, dealing with significant legacy like ecosystems that they have to go and, either wrap some nice things around it to call it zero trust, or, they're not dragging all this legacy technology into the future. They can make some of these big changes very quickly with minimal impact compared to the larger organizations. So, we continue to see, especially, like talking to, like our clients again, this continues to spread, and one of my former colleagues actually wrote a really cool blog about building a zero trust architecture on a beer budget. It's possible. Like, you don't have to have tons of money or resources. It's definitely a very different way of thinking, and that's where you have to get plugged into, no matter what size organization you're part of.
Yeah, and I think, that some of this comes into the next myth that we have that Wolf, you and I have talked about. So if we move from the large organizations, think, okay, this doesn't matter what size. There's a lot of those legacy type systems that are out there. And there's this idea that, so if we manage to move away from the, I can't do zero trust because I'm a large organization. Well, now I can't do zero trust because I have on-premise servers, I have legacy IT systems, they don't support modern authentication. I can't put two-factor authentication. I can't. There's a lot of I can't when people start to think of these older legacy systems. And I know, Wolf, you have some practical experience with legacy systems, but you've also had a lot of conversations with other IT directors and C-level around these systems. So, I'd love you to share, is this true? Can I do zero trust if I've got legacy IT?
Well, the principles are what we need to focus in on when we're talking about legacy. And you're right. I do have experience with this. When I was in a money management firm, we were responsible for mainframes. And these were, you name the risk, they were there. We're running Telnet. If you walked by and you sneezed hard, you suddenly had root. It was really a mess. And what did we do to secure those things? We put them, behind strong network segmentations, and we controlled access to them. Now, at the time, could I do things like saying, hey, that access should only come in through normal behavior channels, should only be, following certain contexts and conditions? No, I couldn't. I didn't have that amount of telemetry. We didn't have that, 10 years ago, but now we do. So when we think about legacy, I think it is absolutely a fiction that zero trust cannot apply to securing legacy systems. I simply think that we need to move where we put the zero trust up the chain so that we're applying these principles at the point of authentication, at the point of connection, into the legacy environments.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And Steve, I think you also had some viewpoints on this as well from conversations in your past experience too.
Yes, unfortunately or fortunately, but I think the biggest thing that we've seen a lot of organizations attempt to do, right, when they go down this journey, and let's all keep in mind, zero trust has been around for more than a decade at this point. So to Wolf's point that he just made, a few seconds ago, the technology is finally caught up to make this a lot easier than it was in the past. Because in the past, we were worried about segmentation gateways all over the place and lots of very expensive hardware-based solutions to make a lot of this happen. But the biggest thing that we see organizations do over and over and over is they go after the really hard problem to solve first.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like, we can't do zero trust. We're just going to give up. And I've seen it firsthand. It's, why are you going after the 1%, of the problem? Why aren't you attacking the 98% and then backing into, the 2 or 1%, problem children, within your environment? And when we have those conversations, level setting that, it's almost like an epiphany. It's like, oh yeah, it's not going to impact basically 100% of the employees within our environment if we go and move to that posture, because all of that other stuff is actually happening in the background through some sort of like automated or manual mechanisms that we're kicking off that an actual user isn't even interacting with those legacy systems. So I just think that reframing the problem, with this context, totally dispels this myth, because the technology is caught up. Like Wolf mentioned, we have all the telemetry to understand what's going on within our environments, especially with those legacy systems that may have not even had the auditing or any sort of logging that was going to give us the information about what's even communicating or interacting with those things. And then on top of that, just reframing the problem that, let's solve the bulk of the issue here and then back into the harder to solve problems later on.
Yeah. No, and all that makes a huge amount of sense. And I think, it's just really interesting when you talk about, how do we redefine and how do we reframe that problem statement, where we can actually focus on sort of the, for lack of a better terminology, the low-hanging fruit. What is the quick win that we can go in to throw a couple more buzzwords out there, right? But it is that idea of, I think everybody thinks that when they're approaching zero trust, they've got to do everything all at once, and they've got to deploy something all at once that's all-encompassing. But I think what all of us on this have sort of seen is that where people win is when they actually take that incremental approach. They focus on one area, and they sort of expand from there. And that's, one thing that, in my job, when I'm talking about, how Cisco is able to show up and support zero trust, it's really important to me that I focus on how the technology is going to help that adoption and how it's going to actually help people towards that realization, no matter where they're at, which is, this next question or this next myth that comes up. It's a little near and dear to my heart just because it's all about you can buy zero trust. And, even though we are a vendor that has a zero trust offering and zero trust practice and zero trust methodology, we're actually, implementing in-house zero trust methodologies. So it's not that we've gone out and bought a product. There's a collection of products that we have that we know are going to support zero trust. And I know, Steve, you and I have talked about this because you're an analyst, I'm a vendor. So we've had a lot of conversations about this, and the one thing that I feel very strongly is it's not a skew. It's not a off the truck thing. And I know you've got a perspective on this too.
Yeah. So, I've been at Forrester for, going on like, I think 5 months now, which I think I heard another analyst mention that you could compare that to dog years. So I don't know what that exactly translates into. But one of the first things that I put out here when I got to Forrester was a blog about this exact topic. And I think the biggest thing that everybody kind of forgets, and, let's just go back to foundational security, right? We do talk about people and processes first. And I know I keep, I sound like a broken record from that front at this point, but, we should be thinking about things in people and process first, and how technology helps enable us to reach our end goal, right? There's vendors that are egregiously, going out there and saying, I will sell you zero trust. You pay me millions of dollars, and we'll get you there by buying our solution. And I think that's so wrong. I think that's totally not real. It's not the truth, because that organization could go back to the way that they were doing things because they implemented that technology poorly. They didn't use that technology to enable, the business objectives or the business goals that they had. So, they went and bought, that zero trust solution, and all it did was create headaches and a deeper, money pit for technology, and deeper technology debt within that organization. So I don't think there's a specific skew, like you mentioned, Amanda, for buying zero trust. I think that zero trust, is kind of this whole change in what you're doing from a security model perspective within your organization. You back into, a framework and an architecture that supports that model. And then you ultimately go and acquire or use the technology components that you have within your organization to support all of that and support what your objectives are at the end of the day. I firmly believe, and I will say this until somebody removes my voice for some reason, that you cannot buy zero trust
Correct. But you can buy technologies that support your zero trust strategy.
Absolutely.
You can buy security solutions that augment that. And that's actually a really great sort of segue into some of the questions that we got over our Q&A submissions. So the first question that came up, and Wolf, I'm going to come to you with this one. I just need to check my notes. So the first question that we got in that was actually asked by a number of different people was, when you are implementing zero trust for your employees, should it be your people, your applications, or your devices first? Is there a particular order that's more successful? And I know that you've had experience, also a lot of conversations where you've seen, successful results versus unsuccessful results. So, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I get to that, though, I want to pull out something Steve said, because I really love the point about process. Effectively, security is always a social issue, right? It's a human issue. It's the technology behind the scenes that makes it easier or harder, and the architecture models that we deploy and the vendor pieces we plug into that. So it has to be thought of as solving that people problem. So that to answer the question, we start with people. Zero trust for the workforce is always the easiest win. Now, the next one is a little bit more tricky, though. Is it easier for us to gain visibility into the devices people are using by instrumenting telemetry on our applications? Oftentimes it is. Or is it easier to have control over those devices that people are using and say, all right, what applications are they going to, so that we can put these zero trust principles on that application access? And I think that's going to vary organization to organization. It really depends. Do you have a real strong application inventory to build off of, or do you have a real strong device inventory?
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue into the next question that came up quite frequently. And Steve, I'm going to come to you because I know that Forrester recently had an architecture guide that came out. So during a zero trust implementation, what are some of those surprises or those gotchas that might come up as you start down this, all right, we're going to be zero trusty. Let's go.
So I think, all joking aside, well, I guess not completely aside, but, when you just mentioned, like, how are we going to be zero trusty? I think that that's the biggest gotcha that we have when we speak to a lot of organizations, is because they don't understand what that means. We've seen both sides of it. They think that it's a technology problem that they need to solve. And when they think about it from that angle, it's like, what do we need to buy to get there? So it's like, quickly dispel that. And it's like, no. Let's take this a couple levels up and talk about what it means to go down, like this zero trust journey kind of together. And then the other kind of gotcha that we come across for a lot of organizations is, or I don't want to call it a gotcha or a surprise, but they don't know where to start. They don't know where to start. And like Wolf mentioned, just level setting, across the board between the technology organizations and the business organizations, and treating it, from a workforce problem. What problems are we trying to solve? A lot of organizations come to us and they say they want to implement zero trust, but they can't answer what they're trying to solve by going, down the zero trust path. It's like, okay, so you're trying to fit a solution to a problem that you don't know what it is. And, that probably resonates from a different angle, but I think we've beaten that one to death already. But, like, I think that a lot of the gotchas and surprises are tied around, once they've figured out kind of where to go down, how do they map, what pieces of technology fit, the problems that they're trying to solve. And a lot of organizations we see start from the identity front, because good identity will fold into the rest of the technology ecosystem as you implement the other technology capabilities that enable zero trust. Because if you go and implement things like microsegmentation or some of those other areas, not having a good identity posture is going to bite you in the ass later, because you're not going to know, who or what is even trying to hit any of those other things within your organization. But that's not to say, like, the other thing is, let's say that you've got a really mature device posture or a very mature network posture. Let's say that you went and deployed a zero trust edge or a SASE solution last year. You can totally fold that into what you're doing as you go down your zero trust journey. You can be like, you've already nailed like 2 or 3 of these things, inadvertently. So that's the other thing that like, or they're like, we'll never be zero trust, or we have to buy all these technologies. The biggest thing is, you already have a bunch of security technologies in your organization that actually help make you mature in different areas. Now we have to figure out what the rest of that roadmap looks like to get you even more mature in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know in the 20 years I've been in the cybersecurity space, it almost feels a little bit like buzzword bingo sometimes when you're thinking about solutions and where do we go and where do we start and how do we do things. So I think you summarized it really great. Is we're thinking about the problems we're trying to solve. And I know, and it's actually kind of funny. This next one is a little bit of buzzword bingo. It's a little bit of a problem. It's something that we all love to hate, and it's very fitting that this was one of the other most popular questions, because today is World Password Day.
Yay!
No, so that means go out and reset your password. So what that really means is, we want to know, how does passwordless really play a role in zero trust? And Wolf, I know you and I have been talking a lot about this. So where does passwordless fit in? And I think it ties a little bit to Steve, what you said about starting with identity and sort of thinking about that. But Wolf, I'll go to you, and that'll be our last question that we have time to cover today.
All right. So in my mind, passwordless is the user benefit in a zero trust business case. And when you think about zero trust and more broadly security, Amanda, you said something earlier, right? How often does security come in and you want to see them? Very rarely for the workforce. They're usually like, don't talk to Wolf. He's going to ask us to change our password to 32 characters or something crazy. So when we think about zero trust and when we think about putting together these initiatives to close some of these gaps, we need to be thinking about what benefits are in it for the user and what barriers we can reduce. So certainly passwordless plays a very strong role in that, as does other things like single sign-on.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been a great discussion. I just have a couple of slides I'm going to go through just to do a really quick wrap up. But my deepest appreciations. I think this was a great dialogue today. So as I mentioned earlier, I am responsible for messaging around zero trust, and we are a vendor. So I just wanted to sort of very quickly cover, we really are thinking about zero trust in terms of how we can show up and how we can help our organizations and our customers actually realize zero trust. And we have multiple different entry points. Both Steve and Wolf talked about the workforce and how we can actually help there. We also have all kinds of security solutions, but what we've done is identify those easy entry points where we can actually help you start on your journey to realizing zero trust within your organization. And if you are interested in learning more about how Cisco can help you on a zero trust journey, we're actually running a couple of workshops. One is focused on all of the aspects around strategy planning. How do I start to think about building that plan, and where do I start in actually realizing? And it's heavily focused on, that workforce element, because we know identity is top of mind and remote work is top of mind. How do we secure that? And then on the other side of things, like there's always two sides to a coin, right? There's technology and then there's planning. So we want to make sure we cover off the technology aspect as well in terms of what it actually looks like to deploy solutions in providing a hands-on lab. So I do invite you to join us. We loved hearing Wolf and I chat today. We're the co-chairs of the strategy and planning track. We also have all kinds of resources to help you on your journey, to help you on your way. But again, I cannot thank you, Steve, enough, and you, Wolf, enough for joining me today. This was a great dialogue, great discussion, and I really hope our listeners, have a little bit of more clarity around, some of the noise that's out there in the market. And I think you guys each have 1 minute for closing thoughts or parting words for our audience.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. It was a very fun, enlightening conversation. The biggest thing that, I just want to kind of leave folks with is, as you go down your zero trust journey, don't try to swallow the entire elephant. It's untenable. It's not going to solve any, huge problems like world hunger or anything like that. Take it one piece at a time. Map out what you've been doing, from a security perspective to how those things are going to help enable, get further down that zero trust journey within your organizations. And kind of weed through, the marketing speak out there and get to the real problems that you're trying to solve by shifting, from a perimeter-based security architecture to one that's based in zero trust.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Amanda, for having me on. Steve, it was a true pleasure listening to you and delving into these facts and fiction. I think we covered a lot of ground here today, a lot of good ground. And Steve, you really nailed it, right? It needs to be incremental. It needs to be focused on problems to solve. And it needs to be human-centric. It needs to be getting out of the way of the users while getting in the way of the adversaries. I think if we go back to first principles and keep an eye on those, we can see many ways where zero trust can be applied throughout our environments. And with that, I think, do we lose Amanda? We win it all the way to the top of the hour. So thank you all again. I'll just say on behalf of Amanda and Duo Security, thanks for joining this webinar. And Steve, thank you again for being our guest.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Take it easy.